Hello everyone, and welcome to our second night of the 2016 summer session. I'm Dexter Marr, and I'll be your host tonight. For those of you that are your first-time visitors here, just want to go through some housekeeping. And our bathrooms are through the door on that side. We have refreshments in the back. I think most of you have found your way to our fantastic refreshment table, and there's hot coffee in the pot, and then there's a cold and hot water dispenser available also. And so please feel free to get refreshments anytime during the evening. Please turn your cell phones off if you have not done so already. Last night's presentations are already on YouTube. And so if you go to youtube.com and type in the search area BSc space Hawaii, you'll get a selection of the choices. There'll be last night's, and then for those that are on live stream, they'll be watching it tonight. Okay. Also, there's going to be a group photo on Thursday. Kind of at 7:30 in the middle of the lectures. So during the break, we'll be having a chance for our famous Honganji photos. It's a tradition. Also like to thank all of our volunteers. My wife Faye, Herb, Marge Detterman, Bobby Nomura. And as well as David and Herb. I said Herb. David, Jamie, and Carrie also. Okay. The format tonight will be the same as we did last night. So there'll be about an hour of lecture, solid lecture, followed by a 10-minute Q&A type of a thing. If you would like to write your questions on a card and just have them read, we can do it that way, or we'll have the microphone to pass around also. Then we'll follow that with about a 10 to 15-minute full break for refreshments and getting a breath of fresh air. And then return for a final, 30 or 40-minute lecture section, followed by a closing, question and answer, period. Okay. And if you want to use ask a question from the floor, please kind of wait for the microphone so we can, record it and it can be, heard. Out there in the universe. Last night we had at least 12 different, viewers in the live stream, and so it is working, and it'll be, good to have all these other people involved. So, without further ado, our topic tonight is making mindfulness American. And for those of you that could not be with us last night, Jeff Wilson is our speaker. As the Star Advertiser called him, our Canadian author. We call him our Canadian scholar, of course. But and so we're delighted to have Jeff, continue, our exploration and our discovery of, what mindfulness, what this major phenomenon, going on in American culture is. Yeah. So Jeff.
Okay, this seems to be picking me up very well. That's great. Hopefully the wave won't drag on it, make scratchy sounds here. Good evening, everyone. Very nice to see you again. My thanks to the brave people who returned for another dose tonight. And I guess I should say hello to everyone in YouTube land as well, since they're virtually with us. I didn't get a chance to look at the video from yesterday. I'm afraid to do so. I'll just let other people look at that. But I was still pretty jet lagged yesterday, actually. So I'm feeling much more rested tonight. Hopefully, we'll have a real good session and good Q&A and everything. So last night, I was just sort of introducing some of the concepts around mindfulness in Buddhism, in the Buddhist past, and talking a bit about the people involved, some of the people involved in bringing Buddhism, bringing mindfulness and Buddhist-based mindfulness to the United States. So we were really just sort of giving some of that background. And then what I want to talk about tonight is, it's not simply that mindfulness got brought to America, but also people have been working to make mindfulness American. Sometimes they explicitly put it in those terms. Other times they don't say it in that way, but that's something that they're involved in doing. They're trying to make mindfulness fit better into American culture and make it more available to Americans by making certain changes to it. So that's a lot of the phenomena we're going to look at tonight. So last night we said, well, people brought it here, but now we're looking at what are they doing once they bring it over and how do they make it fit better? So that's sort of why I talk about making mindfulness into something that's American instead of being Burmese or Japanese or in some way something which is not American, right? This is the concern that people have. And the end result of this process is that you're able to go to Barnes & Noble and get books like The Complete Idiot's Guide to Mindfulness. And this book can not only be conceived of, but can be sold well to a general American audience. Are general Americans idiots? I'll leave that up to you. That's not a polite thing for me to try to define. But anyways, it shows you just how far this sort of comes from its earlier monastic instantiations, right? So what I really want to talk about tonight are sort of patterns or processes that occur. And I'm going to look at the processes whereby Americans have done things to Buddhism to transform it so that it becomes more accessible and more appealing to sort of the general American population. So I'm going to talk about these specific things that people have done. But I want to begin by saying that in some ways, while the things that they're doing are very new, they're definitely innovative, sometimes they're even radical. Also, from another point of view, we can see these as continuations of very venerable patterns in the transmission of Buddhism through various cultures over the more than 2 millennia during which Buddhism has been moving across many cultural borders. The sort of classic example is Buddhism going from being an Indian religion to being a Chinese religion. It doesn't stop being Indian, but it also becomes indelibly Chinese over time. And living at this point in history and looking back, and also living here in the Western world and looking to Asia, we might say, oh, well, India and Asia, they're both countries, India and China, they're both countries in Asia. So, it's not that strange that, that one group imported something from the other. Oh, ancient Indian culture, ancient Chinese culture, they don't share anything at all. They're as different from each other as, say, Chinese culture back in the day from American culture or English culture, something like this. They don't share anything except that they happen to be located not very near each other on the same gigantic landmass, right? But over time, this very, very Indian form of religion was able to cross over the many borders there, or boundaries around Chinese culture, and become a real part of Chinese culture. So this is a very interesting process from the past. There's lessons we can learn from looking at that help us to understand what's going on with Buddhism in America as well. So I want to note that adaptability has really been key to the survival of Buddhism over all these centuries and in all these different cultures. It isn't that Buddhism is one thing and that, you know, the Indians got it right and then the Chinese changed it, oh no, or they got it wrong and that's why it looks different, or, you know, it looks different in Tibet or it looks different in Burma or something like this. The fact that Buddhism is able to change, that's able to adapt to new conditions, is what has allowed it to survive so long in the first place, and what has allowed it to be practiced in such a wide diversity of different cultures. Buddhism is really the first truly universal religion that the human species ever produced. We have other examples that came along afterwards, such as Christianity. Islam is another good example. Many other religions are more or less confined to certain ethnic groups. But Buddhism, what started in a certain ethnic group and then spread to many other types of groups in India, and then spread from there to many non-Indian types of cultures throughout Asia. And eventually now Buddhism can be found in some fashion in most countries around the world, right? So there's always been this adaptability, always been this sort of change going on. And I suggest that some of the things that go on to help these processes of adaptation are things like what I'll talk about tonight. Rearranging the different elements that exist within Buddhism. So it's not that people are necessarily always inventing new things and putting them into Buddhism, but they rearrange things. They see something that seems more attractive, and they highlight it in a way that it wasn't used previously. There's kind of the opposite phenomenon that goes on as well, dealing with problematic aspects of Buddhism. Buddhism always arrives in a new host culture as a very complicated and initially foreign, mix of different ideas and practices and art and all sorts of things. Some of those things will resonate with the new host culture, and some of those things are going to conflict. What conflicts differs each time it goes to a new culture, because the originating, the host culture that it's going into is going to be different. So they're going to have different things that they react to positively and negatively. But we can always predict there will be positive and negative reactions. So you've got to deal with those things that seem negative in whatever new culture it's coming into. Other things that I'll talk about tonight, the ways in which Americans have created their own lineages to sort of authorize themselves as part of the tradition. This is a very common phenomenon that we see in many different Buddhist lineages in Asia that have also gone through this process. Using indigenous terms or concepts. This is basically taking Buddhism out of whatever language it was in, putting it into the new language and new sort of worldview of the new culture it's coming into. And if you're able to successfully do these and related practices such that you bring Buddhism into a new culture, eventually new Buddhisms are going to sprout from that encounter of the selected elements of Buddhism and the environment that it's in now. And if these are really successful, then they themselves will then be exported to yet new cultures. And when that happens, they'll have to go through that sifting and changing process as well. So these are some of the things that we'll talk about here this evening. And there's a particular term which I use in my research, which I call mystifying. This is a term, mystifying or mystification is a process whereby people will obscure or minimize or downplay some of the aspects of a phenomenon in order to then make this available for new meanings, new understandings, new purposes. And in particular, since we're talking about mindfulness this week, we'll look at some of the examples for how Americans have consciously or unconsciously, in different cases, they've obscured or mystified the roots, the history, the usual applications, and some of the sources of authority of mindfulness. Does everyone do this? No, not necessarily. But different people within the overall large mindfulness movement do it to different degrees, and together this contributes to a relative minimization of the Buddhist aspects of mindfulness, and therefore a greater availability of mindfulness to take on new meanings and new purposes in America. So I call this process mystification, and it is something that occurs not only with mindfulness, not only amongst Buddhists, it's not an uncommon phenomenon. So let's look at the first of these things that I was talking about. Rearranging the elements within Buddhism in order to fit the new sort of preferences of a new host culture. So Buddhism, as I've characterized it, is very diverse. It's basically, we could say it's like a mixed bag. I imagine like a container, which is full of all sorts of ideas, all sorts of practices, all sorts of institutions, all sorts of rituals, all sorts of art, all sorts of stuff that's in there. Very, very mixed up in this way, right? And what happens is that new cultures, when they are encountering Buddhism, they kind of reach into that bag and they take out some things that are most interesting to them, and they really pay more attention to these things. And there's other stuff that is less interesting or less immediately compelling or less immediately understandable, and they tend to leave that stuff in the bag. They don't necessarily say, well, it doesn't belong in the bag, it doesn't belong in Buddhism, but they focus on certain things and they leave other things more in the background in this way. And this is a common natural process that has happened with all the forms of Buddhism as they have sort of transmigrated through Asia in the past and as they're now experiencing sort of globalization. Let me show you specifically what I'm talking about here. We can see this in the Asian Buddhist past. We don't have to look only to America, only to the 20th, 21st century. A pretty good example of this is the doctrine of Buddha nature. So Buddha nature is an idea which had its genesis in Indian Buddhism. But we have to say that it really was not a strongly important aspect of Indian Buddhism. It was there. Some Buddhists thought it was important, but it was often just in there with other stuff. Up until sort of middle period Indian Buddhism at least. Buddha nature was just one among many sort of doctrines. There were even groups that repudiated it and said that Buddha nature was not a universal phenomenon and sort of rejected this idea. And then others that thought, no, we have to defend this sort of idea. But it was not central to any particular form of Buddhism through sort of the middle period of Indian Buddhism. But what happened when Buddhism began to be brought into China and the Chinese began to examine it, digest it, look it over, see what they were going to think about this, one thing that they eventually hit upon was this somewhat latent idea of Buddha nature. This began to really resonate with the Chinese, and they began to, much more than the Indians had, they began to really foreground this idea of Buddha nature, really stress it more than Indian lineages up to that point had done. They really started to focus on this. And this Buddha nature then became the focus of whole new systems of Buddhist philosophy, which developed in China. Whole schools of thought, even different lineages were produced now in China based on this idea that, like I said, existed in India, but gained so much greater importance in China. In fact, eventually Buddha nature was taken up to such a degree that it became the fundamental basis for all of the forms of Buddhism in East Asia, right? Because everything in China, then China was so influential in what went to Japan, Korea, and so on, right? So eventually there became a point where every form of Buddhism was fundamentally based in a significant way on affirming this concept of Buddha nature. That's something you could not really say about Indian Buddhism during the same time period, and certainly earlier than that. In fact, this goes even further. Not only did the Chinese sort of magnify it and affirm it as an idea and begin to base things on it, the Japanese eventually took this idea even yet further. They're not talking just about every person or every living being has Buddha nature, but some Japanese important scholar monks began to talk about how plants and trees and grasses have Buddha nature. And inanimate objects, they mentioned specifically like tiles and rocks and other things that we think of as non-sentient, but they affirm these as having Buddha nature as well, in a way in which, back in India, that would not be what they meant with this concept. So the Chinese and then the Japanese have taken it up as something that really made sense to them, and they've run with it, right? So there's Buddha nature back in the day, but they've really sort of magnified it in this way. And you can say, well, why was that? Well, probably it's at least in part because in China, the Taoists and the Confucianists, the sort of people with the native religions and philosophies there, they tended to value the individual, at least in theory, right? And so anything that was too denigrating of people's sort of value or ability to cultivate themselves and perfect themselves probably would not have been affirmed. So the forms of Buddhism that didn't stress Buddha nature got kind of sifted out over time, and this idea of Buddha nature really seemed to appeal to them. Okay, so we can see the same sort of thing going on with mindfulness, meditation, when Buddhism reaches the United States. So the United States, American culture is very different from the sending cultures of Buddhist Asia. And being different, of course, it's going to have different things that resonate with it, and it's going to react and magnify different sorts of things here. So when we look at mindfulness meditation in sort of Asian Buddhist history, we find that while an important thing that's always been in there, as I stressed yesterday, it's also rarely been central, especially for lay people. Lay people rarely engaged in any sort of systematic mindfulness meditation training practice. And of course, lay people are the great majority of actual Buddhists, right? So mindfulness was not central to most people's experiences. Even amongst the monks, mindfulness type meditation practices had died out in many parts of Buddhist Asia in earlier centuries and were recorded in the texts and debated in terms of sort of scholasticism, but were not really actively practiced by monks in many cases. Well, Americans, however, have found this mindfulness to be very appealing. So they've assisted in a process of moving it from being relatively on the periphery or just one thing in the bag. They've really helped to move it into the center and say, this mindfulness meditation is the most important thing in Buddhism. Indeed, it is really what Buddhism is about, and you might potentially get rid of a lot of the other stuff because it's kind of like the branches or the leaves. It's not the heartwood, it's often said, is what this mindfulness meditation is all about. So they haven't made something up, but they have re-emphasized something. They've re-emphasized mindfulness. And also they've moved it from being mostly the property of monks to being largely practiced by and for lay people and taught, in many cases, by lay people. So they're rearranging elements that were already in Buddhism, but they're putting them into new configurations here. Then you've got to deal with off-putting elements. If there are things that seem attractive and that people move towards, there's also things that seem unattractive, aversive, and people move away from. You've always got to deal with the problematic aspects of the total Buddhist tradition that you're inheriting whenever you're taking Buddhism on into a new culture. Importantly, what is problematic is going to differ for each culture. So things that seem totally fine to one group are going to seem kind of dodgy to another, and they're going to have to think about whether they're going to accept them or how they're going to accept them or how they might try to deal with this same sort of situation. This is a very sort of natural process. Let's look back at East Asian history to understand some examples of this in the past, and then we'll see how it's gone on in America as well. So I've got 3 examples here of what's going on, right? So celibacy is the first one. Celibacy was tremendously controversial as Buddhism began to come into China. So Buddhism, in a very significant way, in India, was based on celibacy. It was a non-negotiable practice for monks and nuns. It was more or less the thing that made you actually a monk or not a monk. There were a whole lot of rules for monks, and there were a lot of things they could do to get themselves in trouble. But there were only a few things that would get you immediately kicked out, right there. In fact, even before they've kicked you out, you're already considered to have lost the ordination, and then getting kicked out is really just a formality, right? One of those few things that immediately causes you to, void your monastic status is sex. So this was very, very important, and it was very accepted in Indian society. This idea of celibate monks was found not only in Buddhism, but in various other Indian religions at the time of the Buddha and after the Buddha as well. It was an accepted cultural practice. In fact, it was a valued, an honored sort of practice because it meant that you were putting aside your selfishness and your attachment, and you were transcending sort of, the lusts of the flesh and this sort of thing, and focusing instead on pure religious matters. So this was not only acceptable, this was great. And when celibate Buddhist monks began to bring the practice of Buddhism to China, the Chinese thought, what the hell is this? Because the Chinese did not have a native practice of celibacy. It's the other way around, right? Chinese society in the old days, and it's still significantly true in many cases, was based fundamentally on the family. The family unit was the primary unit of society, not the individual person, and not the overall society, but the family. Chinese culture, Chinese religion was largely based around continuing the family line so that newer generations showed deference and indeed worship, veneration towards older generations. And after people passed away, it was their responsibility to perform the actual rites for the spirits of the deceased ancestors. And this was the primary way in which people were religious. So keeping your family line going, keeping the honor and survival of your family lineage was the most central duty of a person in ancient China. And then suddenly, you got these weird foreigners who are coming across the desert or over the mountains or getting off the boats, and they're saying, we've got a great new religious system for you. Put on some robes and leave your family, right? This is called, leaving the household is the term for becoming a monk. Leave your family behind, repudiate them, shave off your hair, don't have children, and be celibate for the rest of your life. This, it's kind of like if somebody showed up in America and said, we've got a great new system, go out and kill people and then burn their houses down. It's really great and compassionate. It's like it just would not compute in this way. So it was a very difficult thing for people to understand. And the Confucianists and Taoists pushed back at this very hard. They wrote lots of treatises about how clearly evil and wicked Buddhism is, because it destroys the family, destroys society, destroys the government and everything, because everything's based in the family. So this was a problematic aspect of Buddhism, that the Chinese Buddhists, they had to deal with this, right? So, of course, what they started to do is they started to present Buddhism as being pro-family. And although they kept celibacy, they recreated family models within the monastic Sangha. So lineage became very, very important. In the same way that your lineage, like you're passing down your surname through the generations in regular householder life, well, they just recreated this within the monastic Sangha. So you're passing down your lineage from this master to the next disciple to the next disciple in this way. And it totally replicated this. And the Buddhists began to be heavily involved in ancestral worship rites. And this was something that the monks were doing. So now, instead of doing the rituals for your deceased grandfather, because you're not living at home anymore, they would do similar type rituals in the Buddhist monastery for the deceased founder of the monastery in this way. So they're really replicating Chinese patterns, even though they're doing it with Buddhist content now. So they're changing it in order to deal with this problematic sort of thing. And they also started writing lots of treatises about how right action in Buddhism means to show respect to your parents. It's not as if Indian Buddhists said right action means, don't listen to your parents or something like that. There'd been a family aspect to some degree, but the Chinese really started to stress this to deal with a problematic aspect. And they started stressing how praying to the Buddhas and to the Buddhist gods and bodhisattvas will help you to have children. So pray to Guanyin Bodhisattva, and she'll bring you children, and you'll maintain your family line. So this is like a very Chinese way of dealing with what had first been a problem. It ends up actually being something that they can work with after they've done this process. Okay, other things, begging. This is another one. So Indian monks traveling around and begging and living in a homeless lifestyle whereby they live only off of the generosity of the society in this way. This was not only common and acceptable in Indian society and done not just by Buddhist monks, but by religious people in various types of Indian tradition. It was an honored thing to give things up in this way, to live only based on the kindness of others, and therefore allow them to develop good karma and this sort of thing by giving to you. This was a great thing in India. The Chinese looked at that and said, again, what the heck is this about? Begging, like relying on others, making others have to pay for you and put food in your mouth, not being reliant, not doing your part for the family, but like making the family take care of you. Oh, this was disgusting. It was terrible. So, the Buddhists had to deal with this problematic thing. What are we going to do with it? We're supposed to be, living in this manner. So one way in which they started to deal with this situation was by giving more attention to work done in the monastery. So people are not necessarily going out, into the city and working or this way, but they started to do things like farming on the grounds of the monastery and manual labor on the grounds of the monastery, chopping wood, carrying water, cooking their own food. They started to become relatively more self-reliant in this way. In fact, even famously an aphorism developed within the Zen communities, Chinese Zen communities, saying that a day of no work is a day of no eating. So that sounded really good to the Chinese. They're like, okay, all right, we can get behind this sort of thing. Turns out Buddhist monks are not just parasites on the economy after all. So they had to deal with this sort of thing. I'm kind of talking a lot about this. I'm supposed to talk about mindfulness. Maybe I should move on. But just one more thing, since it's on the slide. Japanese example, non-theism. Buddhism is full of gods, full of spirits, full of all sorts of supernatural things. But at the end of the day, they're not truly central to the way in which the tradition has typically been understood. And so when Buddhism was coming into Japan, whose religious system was based on worship of the kami, of sort of the gods or spirits in this way, this was maybe a problematic aspect. The Japanese Buddhists dealt with it by Buddhifying the kami and saying that, oh, these are not just random gods or anything. They've converted to Buddhism, and they're protecting Buddhism now. And even the kami, they appear to us as kami in order to meet us in our culture, but they're actually Buddhas and bodhisattvas. That's their essence. And then they take on the form of the kami so that we can access them and learn about them. So that's why I have this is the the Daibutsu of Nara at Todaiji. This is an enormous Buddha statue, but it's also understood, or was understood when it was created, as being a type of kami at the same time. Because this is the sun Buddha, and then of course the sun goddess was such an important figure in Japanese Shinto mythology, right? So, you know, the emperor's not stupid. What Buddha should I make a giant statue of? You know, should it be the medicine Buddha or something? No, the sun Buddha, because already this sort of sun deity motif is available in Japan. Okay, so all that was just preamble. Actually, this is what I want to talk about. What's going on with America? America also is encountering the mixed bag of Buddhist tradition as having to find out what it favors and what it has problems with and how it's going to deal with the things that Americans happen to have problems with. So they're going to run into, in particular, ideas around the supernatural, which tend to be rather challenging to people in America who don't come from a Buddhist background. So the average American is not brought up to believe in the various supernatural figures that exist in Buddhism. So how are people going to deal with this? So I've got one example. Here's a fierce Tibetan god, this sort of thing. So in Tibet, there's various interpretations, but certainly many Tibetans would see this as a real figure who has real power that you have to be aware of, or who could potentially benefit you in some way. But what are the Americans going to do? They tend to look at this sort of stuff and think of it as idolatry, if they have a Jewish or Christian background, or they tend to think of it as superstition if they're from a more secular scientific mindset. So how are they going to deal with all the stuff that comes along with the package of mindfulness in Buddhism? Well, one thing we see a lot of is turning things into metaphors. This is a really common strategy, and one that seems to work really quite successfully. So when you look at mainstream mindfulness authors, they will talk about different supernatural aspects, things that were supernatural in the Asian Buddhist tradition, but they now talk about them not as being supernatural realities, but as being metaphorical allegories, essentially. And so a really common one that I see in lots of mindfulness literature is discussion of this kind of guy right here. Does anybody know what this is? No? Okay. This is a gaki. This is a hungry ghost, right? I say, does anybody know what it is? It's on the slide. Come on, you guys. My students can figure this out. I know you guys can too, right? Okay. This is a hungry ghost, as you can tell, right? He looks like a hungry ghost. So a gaki, or a preta in Sanskrit, this is a type of being that in traditional Buddhist cosmology, this is something that you might be reborn as. So if you are a very greedy or gluttonous sort of person during this life, you are accruing a certain sort of demerit, or we might call it bad karma. And when you die, it may cause you to be reborn as one of these guys, right? And this sort of spirit is like a very literal instantiation of that greed or gluttony or lust that you had during your life. So a hungry ghost, a gaki, is a suffering spirit who has an enormous, distended, empty belly and a tiny little throat. And they're ravenously hungry. They're trying to cram food into their mouths, but they can't get it down this little, needle-like throat that they've got. And if they manage to get some food down in there, it just turns into flames in their belly, and they end up barfing flames all over the place. So this is seen to be a very inauspicious type of rebirth. And this sort of figure is found in Japan and in Burma and all the Buddhist societies of Asia. And commonly, lineages of Buddhism would perform ceremonies of donating good karma to the invisible but present around us, hungry spirits, so that some of their suffering could be eased. It's a very common sort of practice. We see it in the Zen lineages. We see it in various Chinese lineages and in the Theravadan lineages as well, right? So donating karma to these guys. Well, American mindfulness authors talk about hungry ghosts with some regularity, which might seem surprising because very few of them will suggest that they believe that you could die and come back as, a green, gross kind of ghost that's always puking fire all over itself, right? They don't think that this is something that could really happen. But what they do is they talk about hungry ghosts as being metaphors. So they keep the motif from the tradition, but they change how they talk about it. They change what it means to better fit their own environment. So hungry ghosts go from being spirits out there that we need to take care of, or even could be potentially dangerous to us, or that could be, a future that would be bad for us if we're not careful. They change instead to be hungry ghosts are ourselves when we are caught up in patterns of behavior or patterns of thinking of being obsessed with or addicted with something, right? Especially food or alcohol or something like this. So you'll find people describing themselves as like hungry ghosts, or even just saying, well, I'm a hungry ghost. They don't mean, oh, I'm this guy. They mean, I'm operating in a manner like that. So they've made it metaphorical in this way. And this is how they deal with this sort of thing that could otherwise be sort of uncomfortable, right? In fact, this is what happens with rebirth in general in the mindfulness movement. Absolutely, there are Buddhists in the large, diverse mindfulness movement in America, and many of those Buddhists will affirm rebirth, but there's a lot of people also who are very skeptical about this sort of idea, and instead they treat rebirth as something that occurs moment to moment within this life and is related to the state of your mind. So instead of talking about one of the hellish realms as being something that you might experience in the future if you've been bad in this life, which was always a serious anxiety that people had in Buddhist cultures and in the Asian past. Now mindfulness authors, they say, I was mindless and my mind was caught in anger and turmoil, and I was experiencing the hellish realms at that time, right? Or if they're sort of blissing out in meditation, maybe they're in the God realms in this sort of way, right? Or if they're just acting on brute instinct, now they're in the animal realm in this way. So they, again, sort of make this metaphorical. This is a way of dealing with otherwise difficult or challenging concepts. Okay, another thing that goes on is talking in a looser or vaguer way about the history or background of mindfulness meditation. This is a really common thing. So the idea is, of course, mindfulness comes directly out of specific Buddhist cultures with specific Buddhist lineages and traditions and ways in which mindfulness is understood and how it's practiced. But over time, what we find is that the people in the mindfulness movement often will sort of talk in very general terms. Things like that Complete Idiot's Guide to Mindfulness, right? They'll say how mindfulness comes to us from ancient cultures, or from maybe they'll use words like Eastern culture. Like, which one? That's like hundreds and hundreds of different possibilities right there, right? It becomes very vague. It's very different from talking about, the Vipassana tradition derived from Burmese Theravada and the Ledi Sayadaw lineage. Like, all that specificity gets kind of rubbed out, and you talk just about how this is sort of a generic part of ancient cultures or the wisdom of people from the past in this way. So if you essentially you're erasing a lot of that past because you're not talking about the specifics, and then that allows you to then move forward by putting on new understandings or new practices in this sort of way. So I find this a lot, this sort of rubbing out of the details and presenting a vaguer sort of thing. Of course, eventually this can result in a process where there's no acknowledged connection, even historically, to Buddhism at all. And some mindfulness authors will even deny that the mindfulness has a Buddhist connection because they've been trained, by people who didn't have that connection, who were trained by people who didn't have that connection, and so on. So it's drifted so far away that even the ancient cultures motif is kind of missing at that point. So again, looking at this idea of affirming some aspects of Buddhism and leaving others out, not attacking them. I don't typically see mindfulness authors, regardless of where they are in the movement, saying, oh, Buddhism is full of terrible ideas, and we have to destroy this idea or get rid of that thing. They just basically leave stuff out. If they can't find a way to work it in as a metaphor or whatever, then it'll just be left behind. So they may affirm things like mindfulness, practices of mindfulness, of course. They may affirm the Buddhist idea of suffering and the very cogent Buddhist analysis of how suffering exists in our lives and how it arises and how it may be dealt with. This will usually remain, although it may not be labeled as Buddhist. Also, the Buddhist emphasis on compassion is another thing that I see greatly appreciated by many very mainstream parts of the mindfulness movement. But on the other hand, it's really common to find presentations of mindfulness nowadays with no mention of the Buddhist concept of no self, no mention of the concept of impermanence, no mention of nirvana and what that really means. So it's not that no one's talking about these or that no people in the mindfulness movement affirm them. These are very important to some people, but it's very, very easy to find discussions of mindfulness where those sort of things are just completely left out in a way that you never would have in earlier eras. So this is something certainly that Americans are doing. Versus, I talked about how people like Essen Goenka were teaching mindfulness to lay people in Asia and on a large scale, right? And we're relatively moving it out of Buddhism in some ways, and yet always that presentation is with a very clear presentation of the idea that mindfulness meditation is really helping you to understand the facts of no self and the facts of impermanence. And it is from these discoveries whereby the benefits of mindfulness are going to be conveyed to you. A lot of that's left out in a lot of the more sort of pop instantiations of mindfulness in America. Okay, so of course, the end result of these processes is that we discover that as this headline, which I couldn't resist the screen capture when I saw it, meditation is no longer just for hippies, Buddhists, weirdos, or foreigners. Okay, all right. Very frank about the sort of stereotypes we're dealing with here. Okay, so I had to grab that one. So yes, I think the implication might even be you don't really want to be one of those things. And good news, now it's not just confined to these apparently marginal or disfavored categories. I don't know about you. I think I'm all four of those, actually. So maybe I failed this process. I may or may not be a hippie. I don't have a cell phone, and I've been walking around barefoot for the last 3 days, except when I come in here. I am a Buddhist. I'm definitely a weirdo, and I live in Canada. So I fail this test. But anyways, Buddhism's apparently for me, but also not only for me anymore. And many other people can participate as well. I have to say, this is meant a little tongue-in-cheek, I think, by this author. But on the other hand, I found other real headlines that say very similar things, and they're being totally serious. There's another one that said, meditation no longer just for hippies. Now it's for, what was it? Like financial planners too, or something like that. And it was in a business publication, and they weren't joking. They just meant it, and they were being totally straight with that. So okay. So you make it available for other audiences. So I think the implication here is that if meditation had remained fully Buddhist and the tradition hadn't been changed and things hadn't been emphasized and other things hadn't been hidden and other things hadn't been left out or other things hadn't been re-understood in all these different ways, that basically mindfulness and all the potential of mindfulness for people would have been stuck in these small categories, and it wouldn't have been available for other people. Okay, other processes here. Inventing indigenous lineages. All right, so Buddhism, whenever it moves into a new place, is by definition initially foreign. It was foreign in China, it was foreign in Japan, it's always foreign initially, right? And this is usually a problem, because even while many people are able to appreciate stuff wherever it comes from, also, most people at the end of the day are basically racist. So this is how it has always been. Maybe that's not quite the right term, but they've always been very ethnocentric, very focused on themselves. This was true in China, it was true in Japan, it was true in Burma, it's just true everywhere. People are very focused on their own thing. And back in the day, people were more like this, really, because we were not always being exposed to a diversity of people. Usually, we just only always lived our lives amongst other people just like us, right? So when something is really foreign, back in the day, it's an issue, right? So Buddhism often had to be adjusted to make it seem less foreign, and a major way in which you do this is by telling new stories about who Buddhists are and how Buddhism has come into the culture. And you tell these stories in a way that make yourself part of the story. So you're inventing lineages that make Buddhism a natural thing for you to be practicing, rather than some sort of foreign thing that might not fit so well. We see this again in China. The Chinese were attacking Buddhism not just for being anti-family, not just for being anti-work, but a major critique that people were stating was just simply, this is the religion of foreign barbarians. It must be terrible, because it's not our thing. Foreigners, by definition, of a lower stage of civilization in the older Chinese mind. So, what do we see? The Chinese Buddhists eventually developed new stories based around lineages, because lineages are important in Buddhism, and they were especially important in Chinese culture itself. And so one thing that they did was they invented the Zen lineage. Zen Buddhism is largely based around the idea of lineage. This is how it's been understood in Asia. We tend to think that it's all about meditation and this sort of thing. That's important. But actually, the lineage of patriarchs is, if anything, more central to what makes Zen Zen over the sweep of Chinese history. And so they began telling stories whereby the Buddha, back in the day, okay, yes, we admit, he was Indian, but he woke up to the reality of things as they are, and he taught Buddhism to people, but also he had his deepest understanding, which he only passed along secretly to just one disciple, really. And that one person who could understand the deepest essence of the Buddha, Buddha Dharma, then passed it on to one more person, and on like this. And then eventually, it goes through these Indian masters, and it comes to a master known as Bodhidharma, and he realizes that using his supernatural powers, he looks to China and sees, the Chinese, wow, they're excellent, and they're really ready for this best part of Buddhism, called Zen, or Chan in Chinese. So he leaves India, because India's just been the place that's just been holding Buddhism, until the Chinese were ready for it. He goes to China, and he passes on this best form of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, passes it on to a Chinese person. And then that Chinese disciple becomes a master and passes it on to a new Chinese disciple, and so on. So it passes out of being the property of the Indians and becomes the property of the Chinese. In fact, because this Zen lineage is the true essence of the Buddha Dharma, and it's only now found in China, the Chinese are actually the center of the Buddhist world now, and they're the most important Buddhists in this way, right? And the Indians, are kind of left behind in that way. This is not historically what actually happened. This is all made up. So this lineage from India never existed. It was made up by the Chinese to authorize themselves at the end of the story as being the ones who received it. Otherwise, well, it's a really big coincidence that it just happened to end in China where these stories first appeared, right? So, does this mean, though, that they're faking and making up? No, this sort of inventive process is very natural, and we find it, frankly, not just in Buddhism, not just in Zen. This is a common sort of practice we find in a lot of different cultures back in the day. So they craft this lineage, and they write themselves into the story of Buddhism by doing this. It's going on with Americans, too. Here's an example. This is a book came out a few years ago, called New World Mindfulness, From the Founding Fathers, Emerson and Thoreau, to Your Personal Practice. So you can see, like, I just love these books because they just lay it all out there for you. Some of the subtitles of books on the mindfulness movement are so long. They're like the subtitles of like early 19th century novels, in British novels that will go on in this way. So here's the lineage, right? So these authors claim that the founding fathers were mindful in some way. I have to say they're super vague on this, spend about half a page on it and move on. And then they quickly move into the transcendentalists, people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and so on, who are cultural heroes for Americans, right? They're familiar figures. Back in the day, we had to read this stuff in high school, right? And maybe it still resonates with a lot of people. Walden is something that people like from Thoreau, and they imagine going off in the woods and living simply like him, especially if you live in the city. You tend to like Walden. If you actually live in the woods, you're kind of used to it, that it's not as big a deal. So the transcendentalists are famous figures. And then, so they're saying that there was something going on there, that these people were mindful. They did not do mindfulness meditation. They didn't yet have that. But they were already embodying mindful ways of being, and they had a kind of meditative stance to their spirituality and this sort of thing. So then they move the lineage on in the book. They move it to actual mindfulness teachers, such as themselves, and such as the sort of people that I talked about yesterday who brought it along. And they talk about how maybe Jack Kornfield or others are the actual inheritors of an earlier American lineage of mindfulness in this way. And they're just amplifying it now with the Buddhist practices. And it moves on to you and your personal practice. Because these people are mindfulness teachers, and you're a mindfulness student reading the book, right? So you've now been knit into the story of mindfulness, and it's an American story. It's not a foreign story. It's not an Asian story. It's not even necessarily a Buddhist story. It's a mindfulness story about mindfulness in America. And it makes it seem very American and very natural. And suddenly, you're not a hippie or a weirdo or something like this who's fringe in this way. You're carrying on a tradition that's been here for hundreds of years and goes all the way back to honored cultural figures, right? So this is a repeat of that same sort of process. This is a way in which mindfulness is made familiar and comfortable and accessible to a wider group of Americans. Okay, another thing here. Using indigenous terms and concepts is something that I see quite commonly. So you've got to put Buddhism into the language of a new host culture. If it's always going to be in Pali and no one speaks Pali in China or wherever, then you're not going to get very far. You've got to put it into the new language in some way. And also you've got to express it in ways that resonate with these people. So you've got to find ways of creating stories and so on that are going to make sense, all right? Every different culture does this in its own particular way. Back to China again, you can tell that I teach East Asian studies, right? Because I keep going to these examples. China, you've got the ways in which concepts from Taoism, from Confucianism to a certain extent, were used to express Buddhist concepts. So they took Chinese words and Chinese concepts, and they kind of hollowed them out to a degree and filled them with Buddhist ideas or meanings. So that words like Tao is used for Dharma. Tao is a term, is a complicated term. It means literally a way or a road or a path, but also it referred in a more metaphysical sense to the way of things, the way things go along, the way the universe operates. And that is not identical to the Indic idea of Dharma, but it's not totally different either. And so they would work with these native terms to try to change the way in which people understood Tao to have a more Dharma understanding of this sort of thing. Another idea, sutra, a word that means nothing to people in China. So use the native term of Jing, which is a whole genre of literature already completely familiar. And you start using this to say, these are what our scriptures are, that type of genre, and then even start to write new ones in China. Another example is the koan literature. So those are just kind of words, but then Chinese Zen practitioners begin to write whole new stories about the practice of Buddhism, which, surprise, surprise, star Chinese people as the characters in these stories, right? So this Chinese master met with this Chinese student. They had an encounter, and the Chinese, master enlightened the student through this encounter. These are what the koans typically are like, right? And so now that becomes more important in many cases than the Indian scriptures. You've got your own new stories. There we go. Okay. What's going on too in America with the mindfulness movement? Of course it is. Like I've tried to emphasize here, what's going on with America and mindfulness are new versions of old patterns. So what do we find? Well, just the fact that we're talking about mindfulness, right? As I said yesterday, the term in Pali, which is where we mostly derive a lot of our understanding of mindfulness meditation from, is from scriptures around originally in the Pali language. The term is sati. Well, sati is not a word that means anything to us, right? So we use this word mindfulness instead. I think, as I've already indicated, mindfulness and sati, they're not perfect because there's more going on with sati than just mindfulness. So we have to learn over time in the same way that Tao was not perfect for Dharma and it had to be changed over time, right? So we're using words that are English and familiar. Then another thing is using North American motifs, right? Okay, so the Dharma is Star Wars. Here's a good example of this. So this is an actual book that's out there, and it uses Star Wars, the stories of the Star Wars movies, to teach Buddhism to regular Americans who are not necessarily Buddhists themselves, right? Most Americans are not practicing Buddhists, but nearly every American has seen some of the Star Wars movies, right? Even if you haven't seen it, occasionally I meet people who have never seen them. Is there anyone here who's never seen a Star Wars movie? Everyone has seen a Star Wars, thank God, because, I would leave. I don't want you around if you've never seen Star Wars, right? Everyone's seen it. Everyone's encountered it. Maybe they didn't like it, whatever, but everybody knows what this is. If I say Yoda, people are like, okay, Yoda, I understand that. If I say a Jedi Knight, you're not like, I have no idea what that is at all, right? So using Star Wars as a way of communicating Buddhism is part of this process, right? And what do we find when we actually look at this very book, The Dharma of Star Wars? The first chapter is about mindfulness. In fact, this person, Matthew Bordelin, he's has mindfulness as an important part of his practice, right? So that's the type of Buddhism even that he's following, is a mindfulness-based Buddhism. So I have to say that Star Wars is not even just a random example, because there's a lot of Buddhism actually in these Star Wars movies, right? Including mindfulness specifically. The first of the prequel movies, so chronologically, the first Star Wars movie begins with the two Jedi talking about mindfulness. This is the opening lines of dialogue in the whole series. Unfortunately, it's a terrible movie, but anyways, it just shows you that mindfulness is really a big part of what's going on. And of course, we all know Yoda's really a Zen master, and all this sort of stuff, right? A lot of Buddhism in there. Okay, I'm going to take a break in just a minute, but before I do, I just want to circle back around and point out how universal these practices are, to show how it's going on in other places as well. Other Buddhists are also doing these same sort of things. Not necessarily to the same extent. We find all these practices going on in the mindfulness movement, and sometimes taken very far by some authors. There's a whole spectrum. Some people don't go very far with it. Some people go very, very far with it. Like I say, they completely drop or even deny the connection with Buddhism. They drop lots of things, right? Well, others are doing this too. We should not just say, oh, look what the mindfulness people are doing. Everybody's doing this. Here's a good example. So this is a photograph of, a sign in Japan. It says Hasadera. So this must be Kamakura, right, outside of Tokyo, because that's where that temple is. So what do we see here? Big old swastika. The swastika is an is a Buddhist symbol, right? It starts in India, but it goes all over Buddhist Asia. You can find it everywhere. And to the point where if you're in Japan and you're looking at the map, you're a tourist and you want to find out, I want to go to a temple, the symbol is a swastika. That's how you know there's a temple there. If you're looking for a church, they got a little cross for you, right? So this is the actual identifying symbol. And it's all over the place. And in the first generation, for the Issei here in Hawaii, swastikas were all over the place too, and were regular. You saw them on the temples. You saw them on the statues. You saw them on the books. Early hymn books in Hawaii will have like a great big swastika right on the front. That's how you know it's Buddhist, right? Then you open it up and, oh, yep, sure enough, it's in Japanese. It's a Buddhist hymnal, right? They were all over the place. Nowadays, do we see a lot of swastikas? No. What happened? Mystification. We kind of dealt with this problematic thing. It wasn't a problem. Then there was this thing you may have heard of called Hitler and World War II and everything, right? So suddenly, what was a valued Buddhist symbol became, not through the fault of Japanese Buddhists, became associated with something entirely different. So now it became a problematic aspect of Buddhism that had to be dealt with. So all the incense burners with swastikas, they started to go in the back room. And others that didn't have it, came out. And swastikas that were up on the temples. If you see old photographs, you can see them on temples. Suddenly those swastikas, it's like, we need to rebuild the roof, and they don't put it back up when they do it, right? So they're kind of hiding it, they're minimizing it, they're putting it away. So it's a totally natural process that other groups do. For that matter, in the Honganji tradition, for example, there's a central concept of shinjin, a word that does not translate well into English, but for a couple generations, people were always using the word faith because that seemed like something that might make sense in that way. There's a lot of differences between how Americans tend to understand faith and how Japanese Jodo Shinshu understood shinjin. So it's an imperfect thing, but it's another sort of example of attempts here. So my point being, these are processes that really everyone has to go through to some extent. We're just looking at the particular ways that it's going on with mindfulness. There you go, your favorite slide. The one that says that you don't have to just listen to me anymore at this point. So if I haven't totally exhausted you, I'll take a few questions, but then we're going to give you a chance to take a breath, go get some refreshments, use the washroom, that sort of thing. Do we have any questions right now? Please. Yeah, just use the mic because they may want to pick it up for the camera.
Question as well as perhaps a very quick comment.
Please. Yeah.
I found it interesting, the thing about the hungry ghost and turning them into metaphors.
Yep.
I've read many instances where also that the hungry ghost becomes something that for a lot of American Buddhists teaching and reading or writing in their books, like Pema Chodron will talk about the whole addictive consumption,
Yep.
To material goods, so that the constant feeding, but of no satisfaction, ultimately. So it's very, very useful. I'm enjoying your talk about how this evolution has happened along the way.
Oh, thank you.
And how it becomes more Americanized, each step of the way.
Yeah, so this is something that didn't happen previously. When the idea of hungry ghosts went from India to China, the Chinese were like, okay, that's a type of ghost, right? Went to Japan, okay, that's a type of ghost. Went to America, they're like, that's a type of mental state that may happen to us in this way. The thing is, though, they do it at first because they're uncomfortable. They're afraid of the superstition because they don't naturally believe in this type of spirit that they've never encountered before, right? But it also it becomes still a useful idea or resource. They don't just throw it out, but they find a way to grapple with it and understand it in a way that then does make sense to them. And this is what happens, right? It's kind of like many people treat karma differently than the way it was treated in the past, you know? It becomes not quite as mechanistic or whatever, but people still keep these ideas. They work with them on their own to see what value they may get out of it. So this is a very natural process, I would suggest. Other questions that people may have, or comments for that matter? Thank you for their comment.
Surely Thich Nhat Hanh would be an example of a prominent Buddhist teacher in the mindfulness tradition who doesn't disregard impermanence, no self, maybe even nirvana.
Uh-huh.
You said there were some. He would be one.
Yeah, well, and of course, he's not American. He's Vietnamese, and he is a monk, and he is trained in a specific lineage of Vietnamese Zen, as well as having very clear influences from additional forms of Buddhism in Vietnam. He's kind of a Renaissance man, so he's studied various forms of Buddhism, and he doesn't have just a narrow sectarian approach to things. So not surprisingly, he's a guy who finds ways to keep the old concepts, but also he's just very skillful at talking about them in a way that makes them acceptable or open or accessible to people who don't fit his very specific Vietnamese Buddhist, lineage-based profile. He's just a very skillful communicator in this way. But a lot of Americans who then train in the lineages that he's put into motion do drop a lot of things. Even things that he talks about, they don't necessarily pick it all up because people, they bring themselves to Buddhism or to meditation, right? And so their background, that trajectory, that karma they bring with them impacts how they're going to understand it, what's going to be acceptable to them, and how they're going to move forward once they do encounter it. We shouldn't expect it to not operate that way. That's a pretty obvious thing.
My question is, do you have a prediction as to, you see this mindfulness movement expanding exponentially in America, and it's almost like people will get some kind of a taste of Buddhism. So do you have a prediction in terms of, will that taste generate interest in studying the original roots, the monastic part of Buddhism?
An excellent question. So this is something that I hear in different ways, fairly commonly. For example, I hear people within the mindfulness movement who are aware of the Buddhist connections. Often they trained initially in Buddhist settings, is where they encountered mindfulness meditation, even though they're themselves not necessarily operating in those settings now. But so they know all about it. It's important to them. But they also feel that other Americans won't be as accepting of this sort of stuff or won't see the value in it. But they know that just the meditative awareness itself, the mindfulness, will be potentially interesting. So that's like, well, we'll just give them that. Yes, we know we're leaving out a lot, but that'll be a taste and it'll intrigue them. And as they do mindfulness, they'll start to realize impermanence without even having to be told about it. So then they'll start looking up Buddhism, basically, and they'll start getting into it. They'll back their way into the Dharma, basically, something that I hear people suggest. The truth of the matter is, in my observation, this is not a widespread phenomenon. Most people who encounter a mostly de-Buddhified mindfulness, there's still all this Buddhist connected mindfulness stuff going on, especially this mindfulness going on, right? People who encounter it out here tend to just continue to swim around with it out here. They don't go upstream very often. There are plenty of people who do, but they're definitely just a small slice of the huge number. Like I said, you got 20 million plus Americans doing mindfulness type of meditation for health reasons. Well, if they were all swimming back upstream into Buddhism, we wouldn't have people talking about, oh, the temples may close in Hawaii, this sort of thing. They'd be like, oh my God, keep them away. Too many Buddhists, we can't handle it anymore, right? So clearly, they're not all jumping on board that ship. But at the same time, I have to say, it absolutely does happen. I know many specific cases of people who started in a secularized mindfulness practice and then investigated Buddhism to some extent, took on some further things, and then I also know cases of people who kept going and ended up as, Buddhists, card-carrying Buddhists, if we all had cards, this sort of thing, right? Some of them even end up, going like in a very traditional lineages, become monks or nuns, sort of thing. But the further upstream we go, the fewer people are swimming that far. Maybe I'm an example of this. I said yesterday that my first real encounter with Buddhist practice was mindfulness practice in gym class as a kid. Well, give me time, and here I am wasting your time with all this Buddhist stuff, right? So I'm probably an example of this sort of thing. Even though I didn't ultimately end up in a strongly mindfulness-based tradition, but I did do those things previously, and I still go out and hang out with these people and do the practice because it's part of my research, right? So yeah, it absolutely happens. But if we think that it's going to be like a huge windfall of new Buddhist practitioners, I think so far I haven't yet seen the evidence of it. But it does bring some people in, for sure.
We'll take one last question before the
good
break.
idea.
And if there are other questions, write them down for Jeff, and then he can address it right after.
Yeah, we'll have
we
another
start.
period afterwards. Yeah, please.
Hi. I know these are two different historical periods, but how would you characterize Alan Watts and Eckhart Tolle?
Oh, that's great. Okay, so Alan Watts was operating sort of 50s, 60s, 40s, 50s, 60s, right? Got into Buddhism. And then Eckhart Tolle is someone who's been very popular sort of in the last 10 years or so, right? Very, very popular just at the moment. And very Buddhist in some ways, and especially very much synergy with the mindfulness movement and the mindfulness aspect of Buddhism, because he's always talking about sort of like the power of now, being in the moment, being in the present moment, and that's good enough for you in this way, right? He's also often on Oprah Winfrey. I showed her picture yesterday. So she interviews Thich Nhat Hanh all the time, but she has Eckhart Tolle on even more often, right? So the question is kind of like what's with them and these two major figures in these two different time periods, a mid-20th century and a sort of 21st century thing. I think there's a lot of similarities to them. One difference that I see is that Alan Watts, while he may have sort of gone beyond Buddhism eventually, absolutely he widely acknowledged and freely talked about the fact that he was introduced to Buddhism through reading books, growing up in England, and he began to go to the Buddhist group there and got involved with them. And while he was a person with many interests, so he read a lot of Buddhist stuff, and he met Buddhists and practiced Buddhism, and then he wrote books about it. And he also looked at other stuff such as Taoism. He actually had a whole involvement with mystical forms of Christianity, if I remember correctly as well, right? So he was doing a lot of things, but he was really upfront about his Buddhist interest. He's also part of this process too, because he's a guy who's sifting things, finding the things that seem to work for him and will communicate to other Americans. And so things are changing as they move through Alan Watts in this way. But he was always clear about the Buddhist connections, and he kind of owned it in that way. Eckhart Tolle is very explicit about not being Buddhist and presenting himself as sort of a spiritual guru type in this way, who's kind of come to his own realizations and has something that's unique out of his own realization that he can pass on to you in this way. So we might say that Alan Watts was at a time period when you couldn't really think of this stuff as not being connected to Buddhism in some way. But all these decades later and all these processes later, someone like Eckhart Tolle doesn't have to have the crutch of Buddhism in order to still disseminate a very Buddhist-like type of spiritual program. I think there must be, however, Buddhist study actually in his background because of the many similarities. But he doesn't find that it's useful to market himself in that way. This is my observation. I just say I haven't spent a lot of time exhaustively reading all of Tolle's work, or all of Watts's work for that matter, but these are my impressions of them as a researcher who does kind of watch this stuff. Okay, thank you for the questions. Why don't we take a break of how long, Dexter?
I will blink the lights at 10 minutes after, so a 15-minute break.
15 minutes, great. Okay, all right. Watch out for the blinking.
One that says bothered by gas, G-A-S, greed, anger, and stupidity. And may all beings be happy. Okay, so they're available, for anybody that would like to have them, and so while supplies last. Yes, Paul. Yes, Paul. What about stupidity? But it sounds better when it's gas. Okay, so Jeff.
Okay. Whoa. Okay. How are we doing now? Oh, that's a little better. Okay, thank you very much. All right. So hopefully we had a good break and we're refreshed and ready for another marathon session here. I think this will not be as long or as arduous. Kind of our intent has been sort of the longer part and then the shorter part after the break. We'll see how it goes. But I want to continue with this theme of how people have been making mindfulness into more of an American sort of practice or tradition, and some of the processes that have gone on. And there's really one which is very, very important, such that this is what I'm going to focus the second part of the talk on, specifically the medicalization of mindfulness. So Buddhism being transformed from being religious as its context to being medical or scientific as its context, and mindfulness really being the primary vehicle whereby this transformation is occurring. So this is a major, major phenomenon. And there's one person in particular who's especially important for understanding how this Buddhist mindfulness has been medicalized. He's a gentleman named Dr. John Kabat-Zinn. Hopefully that looks okay. It's a little washed out here, but hopefully you can see him there. So Dr. John Kabat-Zinn, he's a really major figure in the mindfulness movement. I would say he's the most important American figure at this point. There's other people who are very important, like Thich Nhat Hanh, but he's not American, or who have been very, very important in the past, such as Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, and so on, founders of the Insight Meditation Society. But in some ways, Kabat-Zinn has now eclipsed them in terms of sheer influence on what's going on with mindfulness meditation and these adaptations around Buddhism in America. Tremendously important gentleman. So the background, Dr. John Kabat-Zinn, he does not come from a Buddhist background, but he was exposed to Buddhism in college, initially to the Japanese and Korean Zen traditions, and was involved in those Buddhist traditions for a while, and then began to attend the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, which I mentioned yesterday, and train in that Vipassana mindfulness meditation, insight meditation tradition, that lineage that's been so important for bringing mindfulness-related meditation techniques to the West. So he trained in those and actually began to be an instructor in those as well. But he also has this biomedical background. And as it so happened, he was puzzling over how these things might work in concert with each other. And while he was on retreat at the Insight Meditation Society, he had sort of an epiphany on this Buddhist retreat, whereby he realized that he had this vision of how you might move mindfulness meditation out of its religious Buddhist container and instead move it into a medical setting, into a therapeutic setting, change the context, change how you talk about it so that it becomes treated as science, as medicine, as therapy, and thereby all the benefits that he felt people were actually getting in Buddhism from these sort of practices, this would make them much more available to people out in wider American society. People who would never, ever come on a Buddhist retreat would nonetheless now get access to it because they're not into religion or Buddhism, but everybody is, encountering the healthcare system, the medical system in some fashion. And this would be a good way to bring it out to where they are and sort of give it a new type of authority so that people would trust it and would get involved. People who would never have gotten involved if it had been presented as Buddhist. He also thought about how if he did this, then a whole new class of meditation instructors and mindfulness teaching or prescribing doctors and therapists and others might sort of grow out of this. And so these would be people who would be transforming the medical and therapeutic establishments through this Buddhist mindfulness, and they'd be able to practice a right livelihood, therefore, and so on. So he had this sort of grand vision that came to him as an epiphany. And out of this, he created something that came to be called mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR. Didn't have that name initially, but that's eventually what the name settled on. And in 1979, after this sort of vision that he had, he created his stress reduction clinic there in Massachusetts and began working on how to present mindfulness meditation in a medical setting, in a non-religious and certainly non-Buddhist manner. So that the whole thing would be contextualized as medicine, not as religion. This is kind of the basic paradigm shift that he was trying to enact. And eventually he was very, very successful with this. And he did a lot of the same processes that we've already talked about, minimizing the Buddhist connections and making things metaphorical or simply dropping certain things, emphasizing other things, mindfulness especially, and certain related practices that he also taught in his MBSR. So he did a lot of these things and then especially gave it this medical sort of cast. The basic theory to MBSR, if we want to boil it down to one thing, because we only have a few minutes, it's the idea that stress is a serious medical issue. Stress itself is just a problem, but also stress contributes to a very wide range of illnesses, both what we might characterize as mental illnesses, but also many things we might characterize as physical illnesses. That mind-body connection, it's not even just like mind-body with a connection between them, but they're actually all part of the same system in a way. This is something that in 1979, he is kind of ahead of the curve in some ways talking about this, but these days, because there has been this sort of seismic shift in the medical profession, partially through these sort of influences, this is now a widely acknowledged type of idea, right? So his idea then was stress is something that can be dealt with through mindfulness. That mindfulness practice helps you to deal with stress. And then, so if it attacks the stress that is causing so many problems, if it decreases it or helps you deal with it in a better manner, then your specific ailments may be bettered by this or even healed in some cases, right? And then also your entire wellness will increase so that you're less likely to develop other sorts of things, right? And how does this mindfulness then operate? Like what's going on in terms of sort of the medical application of it? Well, the basic theory in MBSR, and we see this in a lot of other aspects of the mindfulness movement as well, is that mindfulness allows you to not react to stressors or to problems. Like, so when you're having a difficult situation or a bad day or some sort of triggering something in your life, you can, if you're mindful, you can just see what's going on in your mind, see how you're reacting to it, and then not cling to that reaction. And you just can kind of let it be and then let it pass. And so you don't end up clinging on to the pain or clinging on to the stress or clinging on to the to the problem that you have. And therefore, your total stress goes down, your blood pressure is affected, many other aspects of your health are affected by this sort of thing. This is sort of a simplification, but in a nutshell, that's kind of the idea of what's going on with MBSR. So they were teaching, so they called it mindfulness-based stress reduction. They didn't call it, sati meditation to be done by monks or something like this. They made it really medical sounding, mindfulness-based stress reduction. Everybody wants less stress, right? So this was very appealing. There's not a lot of people who are like, I like my stress, I'm going to keep it. Everybody wanted to get rid of the stress. Especially, this was 1979, this is the 80s essentially that he's doing this. And the 80s were all about getting rid of your stress. So it was a very good time for this sort of thing. So one thing that John Kabat-Zinn and other people in his branch of the mindfulness movement do is they define mindfulness in a very clear way that's very accessible, that doesn't have Buddhist jargon, and it allows people to immediately understand it. And this is just one quote, but this is the basic way that he may change the words around a little, but this is how he's always expressing it. Mindfulness is awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So it's this kind of open awareness that is aware of what's going on in the world and aware of what's going on in the mind, but doesn't judge it, doesn't react in any particular way to what's going on inside or outside in this way. It's about knowing what's on your mind. So this is just really clear, very simple, very accessible. It doesn't mention Buddhism. It's very much on the other side of that mystification process here. And this is something that can be talked about in a medical or therapeutic sort of situation. So as a matter of fact, he now often says things in interviews, things like, mindfulness, the heart of Buddhist meditation, is at the core of being able to live life as if it really matters. Such an American turn of phrase to me. I don't hear that turn of phrase in classical Buddhist scriptures from Asia. It has nothing to do with Buddhism. It's a very interesting thing. He just said it was the heart of Buddhism. Now he says it has nothing to do with Buddhism, right? It has to do with freedom. Yeah, I know. So there's a little contradiction here, maybe. But this is like his skillful way of communicating, right? He acknowledges the Buddhist connection, but then he also minimizes at the same time. He says it's about freedom instead. Mindfulness is so powerful that the fact it comes out of Buddhism is irrelevant. Okay? So what matters is that mindfulness is something people can do. It is now accessible to them, and you don't have to be stuck on the Buddhist content. So this is not meant to be insulting to Buddhists. That's not what he's doing here, although Buddhists have reacted in various ways to this sort of thing, right? What he's trying to do is say, all of you non-Buddhists out there who don't give a fig about, Buddhism, and who might even stay away if you heard something was Buddhist, you don't have to worry. Okay, the Buddhist thing back in the day, but mindfulness is very powerful, and it's about freedom, and this is something that every American can affirm, right? If you don't like freedom, you're not American. I think that's basically, you don't have to be Donald Trump to affirm this as a value, right? So this is a very smart way of putting it, right? This is a way of opening it up to many people and making it accessible to them. So here's this actual practice of mindfulness-based stress reduction. Here's how they do it. I'm not sure how good this picture is here in this forum, but hopefully you can see what's going on. What we have is a gathering of people sitting in a circle, and they're being taught MBSR. And the way in which they do it these days, typically, is they have 8 weeks of sessions. It used to be 10 weeks. Now they've decreased the number of them, but they've increased the amount of time each session is. So if you think of it as equivalent to 10 10 weeks, but you go for 1 day, once a week. So it's like, back in the day, a 10-day retreat, which is where he was trained in mindfulness, made on 10-day retreats in the Vipassana tradition, right? But now it's been parceled out. Instead of 10 consecutive days, you got to go on retreat, you got to be silent, you got to take vows and all this sort of stuff. Now you're in your normal life, but once a week you come in for a few hours and you get trained in this group to do the thing, and then you have homework that you do during the rest of the week, but you're living your daily life, right? It's 8 weeks nowadays, but it's still the same sort of curriculum. So you go in once a week, and typically you've been referred there by your doctor, or by maybe by your psychiatrist or someone like this, right? So you go to the stress reduction clinic or to some other medical type of setting. You come in wearing your regular street clothes. You're not putting on robes. You're not somehow joining some sort of religious group in this way. You sit in a circle. You've got an instructor, but he's sitting there with you, and he's training you in this way. You talk about mindfulness in a very secular manner. It's stressed that this is medicine. Essentially, there's a medical model. They may or may not mention the Buddhist connection, or at least the connection to ancient wisdom cultures in this way, right? That may be entirely left out. Even if it's mentioned, however, everybody's there for medical reasons. Like I said, you got a doctor's note to come to this meeting in many cases. And they will train people to do mindfulness exercises, such as Vipassana type noting, so paying close attention to your actions and to your mental reactions to actions at all times, so learning how to do that sort of thing. They often do this with mindful eating, actually. I'll talk more about mindful eating tomorrow, but in a nutshell, they'll do an exercise, for example, where they'll eat a raisin very mindfully. And they'll really pay attention to what's going on, and they'll note the texture and the flavor. So, whereas most of us are like, oh, raisins, they're like, you just chew a big bunch of it. They're like, take one and like spend like a whole minute just eating, like really being aware of everything going on in this eating of just this one little morsel of food, right? It's a very good initial training in this way. And it can be presented as totally medical or secular. There's nothing Buddhist about eating raisins, right? So, they also will learn some yoga stretches. They do body scanning type mindfulness exercise where you're kind of aware of the state of your body and each part of your body. Remember, mindfulness of the body is one of those 4 foundations of mindfulness, right? It's not all just about mental processes. And they'll learn a few other practices. So they're getting trained in Buddhist practices. These directly come right out of Buddhism. He trained in them in Buddhist settings. He was trained by Buddhist teachers to do these things. But when he teaches them to new audiences of non-Buddhist Americans, they're learning the same things, but they're not presented as Buddhism. They're presented as medicine, as therapy instead, in this way. So this has been a very successful model. Huge numbers of Americans have gone through this MBSR program, whether at his particular site in Massachusetts or the many other places where MBSR is going on. It's something that's common in the American medical system at this point. I'm sure you can get it here through the healthcare system in Hawaii. I haven't looked into what the specifics are of what may be going on at hospitals locally, but I'm sure that you can have access to it because it's all over the place at this point. And in fact, it's now so accepted a practice that your insurance will cover it in many cases, right? So now you get insurance to cover the Buddhist practice, but it's not presented as Buddhism. It's very interesting, right? Because it doesn't appear to be Buddhist, and that's intentional here. So what's gone on is that it's moved from even like hospitals and a sort of more of a medical situation to the closely allied therapeutic, psychotherapeutic profession, right? A very specific sort of instantiation of the overall health system in America. So mindfulness has become very popular with therapists and counselors. They'll teach mindfulness to their clients, and specific mindfulness-based therapies now have been developed. So MBSR really started with people dealing with their stress and also with their pain levels. These were important, right? And a lot of the idea was that if you are mindful of your pain, you actually deal with it better. You know, you're not clinging to it or pushing it away, but you just kind of note how pain just is kind of there. It actually lowers your reaction to pain, and therefore you need to take less drugs to deal with it, and so you don't get all the side effects of the drugs, which can include everything from addiction to all sorts of other internal side effects, and also they're expensive and so on, right? If you can deal with your pain or stress through mental techniques rather than through taking pharmaceuticals, all the better, right? Well, so it moves on from there into all these specific forms of therapy. This is just scratching the surface. There's so many forms of mindfulness-based therapies that are becoming more and more popular in America today. So you will go in to see your therapist, and they will teach you about mindfulness. They'll give you the same sort of training that you get in MBSR, which is the same sort of training that you got at the Insight Meditation Center, a Buddhist retreat center, which is the same sort of training that people were getting back in Burma in the day. So they keep changing the context around it, but the practices are really rather the same through all these different evolutions. It's quite interesting. So yeah, behavioral cognitive therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, that's the really huge one these days, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, many of these sort of things. Where the particular college that I work at, we have a school of social work there, and I see lots of work being done by my colleagues around mindfulness. I'm in religious studies, so I'm coming at it from a certain angle. They're actually doing a lot more mindfulness stuff that goes on in my classes, but they're doing it entirely within a medical or sort of social work, therapeutic sort of model without really being conscious of the Buddhist connections in many cases. Certainly not, it's not very important for them. And so what we find is that mindfulness is being recommended as treatment for a huge range of illnesses that people suffer from in modern day America. This is a very incomplete list. There's way more than this, but these are just some of the things. For every one of these, there's books and articles, journal publications, studies, all sorts of stuff for every one of these sort of things. So it's not just a random list I came up with, but all of these you can just go right out there and find, things like The Mindful Path Through Depression, a well-selling book, and many others. All of these different things are going on. You can see the huge range of things, right? Believing that mindfulness can help them deal with this. And part of this process then has been doing scientific studies to determine the degree to which mindfulness practice has positive effects on people's health. So there's been a huge number, there's hundreds of these studies every year. This is really big business, among other things, and people are getting major grants from the government and other sources to conduct research into the therapeutic medical value of mindfulness meditation practices. There are all these studies, thousands and thousands of them. At this point, they started with John Kabat-Zinn. He did the first of these back in the 80s, really, and then they've grown into this whole other thing. They tend to show positive effects. We also have to be careful about them. They also very commonly have a small pool of participants. They're run by people who are themselves mindfulness proponents, so they're looking for positive effects, and it's hard to say how much this can be repeated and everything. So there was a big study that suggested that a lot of these studies have flaws in their methods, and so we have to be careful about their findings. But at the same time, there have been so many of these studies, and some of them are quite rigorous, that it's pretty clear that mindfulness may not solve every sort of problem, and it may not work for everyone, but as a general principle, this mindfulness is definitely having positive effects on people's health and wellness in America. So it's really a big sort of phenomenon now. So something that comes along with this mystifying and medicalizing is sort of there's a marketing that's going on, right? That's something we could say is part of this process. People are learning how to market Buddhist mindfulness practices for the American public. So they try it as in this way, try it in that way, and they find what works over time. And eventually you get to the point where you have not just Buddhists presenting it, but non-Buddhists or people who's presenting as non-Buddhists. And here's a good example, Mindful Magazine. This is a popular magazine. Its subscription rate is in the very healthy tens of thousands. And Mindful is actually published by people who come out of a specific Buddhist lineage, but they have connections to the Shambhala community and to other Buddhist communities. But they've consciously chosen to create a magazine that sells or markets mindfulness in this way, right, to the American public without it being Buddhist in any way. Like they have basically an editorial policy of never discussing Buddhism. It's very rare to see any mention of anything Buddhist in this magazine at all. So they've found a way of marketing mindfulness, presenting it in a way which is basically non-Buddhist. They hide that sort of content, even though this mindful that's in the title, this is referring to sati and these sort of practices at their root, right? The funny thing is that if you are Buddhist or you've been paying attention, you can still look at this and you see kind of the fingerprints. But if you're not Buddhist, it does not transmit or signal Buddhism to you. It's very, very skillful. So if you're not Buddhist, you look at it and you're like, mindfulness. I heard about that at the gym. You know, maybe I'll pick this up. It'll have some recipes in it, and maybe I'll learn something about how I can calm down and not be so stressed out at work, this sort of thing, right? That's the purpose of it. But there's more that's going on here as well. Like a comment or question?
Just a comment that
Yeah.
the magazine also has an online presence too, so they have a greater
It's very
reach
big.
than just the magazine subscription.
Oh yeah, I'm just showing the covers of the print version, but actually has a whole universe of online presence of. So there's various electronic versions, like you can get a tablet version or this sort of thing. But they have their own website, which produces original content as well as stuff from inside the magazine. They've been working on mindful TV, and they have videos. All this stuff is going on, and this is just one organization. There's a whole bunch of these, right? But this is one that's just a very particular good case study. So it doesn't have to be, if you're not Buddhist, it doesn't seem very Buddhist. On the other hand, let's look at this as if it were Buddhist. And what does it suddenly look like? Well, we don't see a lot of monks in robes, but why is everybody sitting down? Okay. It's still, the form is still there, even if it's not out in your face. Like, the fingerprints are still there. There's still a karma of Buddhism that's operating, that's passing along in this way. So that you have all these people, they sit there, and you have the title Mindful here, and if you actually read some of the subtitles and everything, like you can see the evidence of it. When I read through it, I actually see a lot of Buddhism between the lines, but it's never on the lines because of the way they've chosen to market this mindfulness as their thing they're promoting, right? Very, very interesting and pretty skillful use of it. And so here's what results. This is an ad for mindfulness from Mindful, promoting the magazine and promoting the idea of mindfulness. And what do we see here? I apologize, it's kind of shaky. I guess maybe the air conditioner blows on it. Yeah, we're right in front of the air conditioner, just as it so happens. Hopefully you're not going to get seasick looking at all this text I'm using all week long here. But what do we see? What is mindfulness? A very important question. So what is mindfulness? Let's learn what mindfulness is, according to Mindful and to this very large branch of the mindfulness movement in America. Well, what is mindfulness? Anyone can do it. It's kind of a non sequitur, actually. What is mindfulness? Anyone can do it. Like, we haven't said what it is. We're saying who can do it instead, right? But this is what they want you to know about it. Anyone can do it. Mindfulness is the moment-by-moment awareness of whatever arises in our body, mind, emotions, the world around us. That's a very Jon Kabat-Zinn type of definition, right? It's very generic, very accessible, and very non-explicitly Buddhist, right? It's a formal practice and a way of living, cultivates universal human qualities, not specific Buddhist ones, right? So it doesn't conflict with anyone's religion, beliefs, or lifestyle. So they're really anxious to make sure you get it. No, it's not Buddhism, not religion. We're not even going to say it's not Buddhism. We're going to say it doesn't conflict with whatever you are, okay, right? It always helps. So what is mindfulness? It always helps. Again, this kind of this non sequitur quality to it. But this is very effective marketing, however, right? So they're talking about who can do it, not what it is, firstly. Then they go on to define it. They're talking about what it does. It helps you, like medicine, like therapy. This is what it's for, right? It helps. Practicing mindfulness always makes our lives better. It has proven results for health, happiness, work, and related. Proven. It's scientific. Doctors, 9 out of 10 doctors recommend mindfulness, so you can be sure that it's good, right? It's evidence-based. Again, you don't have to take mindfulness on faith. Its positive effects are documented by both science and experience. So that medical, scientific, rational presentation of Buddhist-derived practices. It's a way of living instead of a religion, basically is the implication. It offers hope for the future. So it has a kind of a utopian quality to it as well. When people live mindfully, our society works better, and so on. And we've got this random headless picture that goes along with it. So, like I say, Mindful presents itself as non-Buddhist. But the editor of Mindful, I just punched the screen, the editor of Mindful is Buddhist and has been trained in a specific Buddhist lineage for many decades, right? And if you look at the masthead, the people who are involved, the editors, the publisher, all of them are Buddhist or learned mindfulness initially in Buddhist contexts, Buddhist environments, Buddhist retreat centers, this sort of thing. So whether or not they want to carry the card, they're at most one step away from Buddhism and have been involved with Buddhism, and that's where they got their mindfulness start. But they're presenting this as non-Buddhist in this way. Because when you look up here, if we played a game, I'd say, so find the Buddhism for me. What Buddhism do we see here? If there's any, it's very subtle. We can again ask, why is our headless person seated, apparently, with even maybe, it's not a perfect meditation posture, but that ankle's kind of creeping up towards the knee there. Maybe it's a half lotus position, this sort of thing, right? Mindful is a word that's English, but also is a word that's used to translate technical Buddhist vocabulary. So the Buddhism here is, it's not here, it's like it's back here. It's behind the screen. It supports what you see out here in front. It's not put in the front anymore. The Buddhism is put in the back. So it's a very interesting, very effective strategy. And it is these sort of processes that have allowed mindfulness to become so omnipresent, so impactful, so favored by so many people. Okay, one last process that I promised on slide number 2. So here it is. I talked about how if Buddhism is successfully able to cross over cultural barriers and truly implant itself in a new culture and become part of that new culture, if this really succeeds, the real test is, does it then move out of that culture into yet new places? And does this newly Chinese or newly Japanese or whatever form Buddhism, does it transport ultimately as well? So, for example, Zen Buddhism. Like I said, the story of Chinese Zen is that they got it from China, but it's not true. They made it up in China. And then it went from China, but it was so successful as a Chinese creation of Buddhism that it didn't just stay there, right? It went to Japan, it went to Korea, it went to Vietnam. It had influences in Tibet, and certainly it's come to America. So this was a successful domestication, enculturation, adaptation of Buddhism into Chinese culture such that it could then become an export Buddhism. It's exactly what we are seeing with Americanized mindfulness, this medicalized, adapted sort of mindfulness. I went to Denmark, I guess a couple of years ago to present research at a conference there. And it took me basically no time at all to quickly find mindfulness-related books. And what is the word that they are using in Denmark? They're using the word mindfulness. So they're just taking an English word from the American literature and using it as how they talk about mindfulness in Denmark. So it's gone to Europe. There's a couple examples. That one over there is a Jon Kabat-Zinn book. This is that's been translated, right? This is a book that is by an actual author there in Denmark. And then South America, here we find it again. So in Spanish, in Chile, this is just one screen capture I did. What is mindfulness? It says, just like we've just been talking about in English. So this Americanized mindfulness is now spreading to South America. And obviously it will get changed, like it will become Chilean in some fashion, but it's going to be it's also an American religious influence onto what's going on in Chile. Even as things change, they're also being changed because there's a new sort of influence here. So it's going to Europe, it's going to South America, this adapted American-based mindfulness. It's going to Asia too. Here's translation of Jon Kabat-Zinn's books, one of them, into Korean. And they're using a Korean term, but it's basically a term used to translate this word mindfulness. And we're talking about a culture which has a long Buddhist history, longer Buddhist history than Japan. But how are they learning about Buddhist-derived mindfulness meditation practices? They're learning about it from Americans, that in a form that has been medicalized and changed. So this is a successful export product now for us. Here's the last example. Japan. What is the word which is being used to translate mindfulness? Well, here it is. Mindfulness. This is the word, mindfulness. That's what it says right here. I put it up there for you too. This is Jon Kabat-Zinn. Wherever you go, there you are. That's the original title. So this is like, you could not be more obvious that this is not just something from the indigenous Japanese Buddhist tradition. This is an imported American version of Buddhist meditation. And so it's going to have the same sort of Buddhist context, American context, American understandings. The Japanese will then sift it again, and some things may stay and some things may go, or some things may be changed, everything, but they're going to be impacted by this. So it's really interesting. We're talking about cultures that have their own indigenous forms of mindfulness meditation are now adopting these Americanized forms. So mindfulness is something people are talking about rather than the native Japanese terms. I say native Japanese terms, of course, these are all, they had to be adapted over centuries under influence from Korea and China, but nonetheless, they are indigenous traditions at this point. So there you go, very successful, moving all around the world, and this is one of the big things in mindfulness. So those are my formal remarks for today. Thank you for sticking with it. We're close to 9 o'clock, but if people still have any energy left, I'm happy to still take some questions, some comments, some discussion here for a few minutes before we let everybody run home.
Well, I'll take host privilege by asking a question
Please,
first.
go for it.
You know, in American culture, the 800-pound gorilla is Christianity, and I'm thinking that maybe some of this un-Buddhist, approach to things is a way to make it more accessible, to Christian communities, because we find that lots of churches are doing meditation also, and you didn't mention, that element, of American acculturation and the impact on, the Native American religion.
You're entirely right. And many of the mindfulness authors that I study are totally explicit that they're doing these things to make it more available in a generally Christian culture. That is to say, it makes it easier for them to operate and not be the targets of as much discrimination potentially, but also that it allows Christians to practice mindfulness. This is why they're bending over backwards to say, it's not a religion, or it doesn't impact your religion. You can be any religion, and you can do mindfulness. These people want it to go as large as it possibly can. And so the funny thing actually is, a lot of what's going on here is Buddhist-based compassion for other people, including for non-Buddhists. They care about the non-Buddhists around them. They see that they are suffering. They have tools that could help with that suffering. And in many cases, they're willing to de-Buddhicize their Buddhism in order to help non-Buddhists due to their compassionate Buddhist orientation towards alleviating suffering. So for Buddhist reasons, they delete the Buddhism from what they're doing and give it to non-Buddhists. So that's absolutely a thing that's going on. And now there are books on Christian mindfulness and so on that are out there. But let's be clear, what they're doing is Buddhist mindfulness that's now been put into a Christian context.
There's also churches calling themselves mindful Christians.
Yes, yeah, you get mindful Christians, mindful Jews. I've seen mindful Muslims at this point, yeah.
Yeah, so I was just saying that there are groups calling themselves mindful Christians as a way to integrate it, and I think there's a point worth making, which is for the Christians, it's a way for them not to feel disloyal to their own religion.
That's right.
That they can embrace this other practice and not be considered like non-Christian or
that's right.
Disloyal to their faith.
And so in that fashion, they are also going through these same patterns I've talked about. They're making new lineages and new stories where their forms of things are privileged and where it's not foreign or strange or clashing in some way, but it's natural in this sort of way. And so exposure to Buddhism and to the mindfulness movement causes Christians and Jews to re-understand even what's going on in their own stories, so that they'll do things like they'll go back to the Gospels and they'll say, so what was Jesus doing during those 40 days in the desert? Mindfulness, But that's not necessarily how it was understood in the past. But on the other hand, there's nothing that it says, and then God said Jesus was absolutely not doing mindfulness. That's not in there. So you can read it in, and it kind of makes a sort of sense. And then, so Christianity evolves just like Buddhism does. Okay, sorry, you got a question, please.
I want to hear from you about Steve Jobs, who died 3 years ago. 3 years ago.
Uh-huh.
He was a CEO of Apple Computer.
Yes.
Okay. I heard that he was a follower of Soto Zen teacher called Chino Roshi.
Yes.
But I don't know how connection is, but if you know, would you let me know his connection to Soto Zen
sure.
lineage? And also, one of the things that I still remember about Steve Jobs was that in the morning he wakes up and tell himself, today is the first day to live. At the same time, today is the last day to live.
Yes.
This sounds like a really Japanese mind, because I heard that in Japan too.
Yeah.
But this is quite mindful in content.
That's exactly what it is. Steve Jobs did train in Zen Buddhism in California, Yeah, this is the first day to live, this is the last day. I mean, it's very much, it's the same sort of idea as ichigo, ichie. You know, like it's the same type of mindset of just this moment, just this encounter, no past, no future, just being with the moment in that way. So this is something that comes out in different turns of phrase, but a basic idea that you find in many forms of Buddhism, and therefore it's just kind of out there in Japanese culture because of the big Buddhist influence on that culture. So yeah, he did actually train as a Zen Buddhist, and it was a very important part of his life, actually. That is correct.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, if there's one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you know what is Hongwanji's response to the emergence of mindfulness, and whatever that response is, whether they're sitting back or perhaps exploring. Do you have thoughts of what Hongwanji might do to strengthen itself through the mindfulness movement?
An excellent question. That's going to be one of our main topics of discussion for Friday. So I'll save that until then. But thank you. I'm glad to hear that people are interested in what I plan to talk about. That's a good sign for me. We'll talk about it on Friday. So please be sure to come back then in that case. All right. So I dodged that one. Now I can come up with some answer in the next couple of days, and then we'll deal with it. I think that should probably wrap it up. It's just about 9 o'clock. And thank you all for
Yes,
your patience
thank
and your energy today. I appreciate it.